Now, I'd like to welcome the Editor-in-Chief of CNBC Africa, Godfrey Mutizwa, who will be hosting the next panel discussion on the topic challenges of accessibility in the industry. Thank you so much for joining us, Godfrey.
I'm going to begin with a confession. My confession is that in all the years that I've been around, covering stories on the continent and doing all of that, I have never once thought about infrastructure and its connectedness to women. I haven't connected access to infrastructure.
You're not the only one.
The common good that we think infrastructure is bringing to the people has not been equitably distributed.
Indeed.
So we learn every single day. Thank you, Zinati. So before we get into our next discussion, let's take a look at this short synseta.
Major infrastructure failures quickly and radically reduce the quality of life and productivity of communities. On the other hand, welfare is enhanced by improved infrastructure services, which in turn fosters economic growth. One of the major challenges of economic development is to provide infrastructure services to meet the demands of businesses, households, and other users. Over the past few decades, infrastructure has improved and become more available in developing countries. In many cases, however, the full benefits of past investments are not being realized, resulting in a serious waste of resources and lost economic opportunities. It is often assumed that women will automatically benefit from new infrastructure projects in the same way as men do, but women have distinctly different needs and social roles. For example, urban design plays a major role in people's lives, but the risks of uncontrolled urbanization, urban sprawl and slums are often greater for women, as they are more likely to be targets of assaults and harassment. Improved urban infrastructure with a gender perspective would demand public lighting, safe public spaces, and safe public transport to help mitigate safety-related risks that women have to face in their everyday life.
And for the discussion, here are our panelists.
Dr. Wanda Chanet, Director at Turner & Townsend. Ayumi Uwasa, Deputy Director of the OECD Development Center. And Christelle Kwizera, Founder at Water Access Rwanda.
For those who are long in the tooth, you will remember Chairman Mao once famously said, "Women hold up half the sky." Now, while they may have made some advances in the decades since his declaration and since the Beijing Women's Conference in 1995, it remains true today that women across the world remain unequal players and participants in our quest for human advancement. In this session, we're exploring how our focal point of discussion today, infrastructure, is holding back women from fulfilling their role and dreams. I wanted to warn you at the beginning, we're struggling to get in touch with our third panelist, that's Christelle, but we'll see how that conversation goes. Let's begin the discussion by getting an overview of the thoughts of our panelists who are joining us here today. And I want to get your thoughts first. Ayuma, if you can just give me the sense that you have when you are asked the question, women and accessibility in infrastructure, what needs to be done?
Thank you, Godfrey, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm excited for this opportunity to speak on today's topic. I've been working on gender equality in my country and in developing countries for a quarter-century in National Gender Ministry, in a bilateral donor agency, and now in a multilateral organization. Let me share my thoughts with 3 main points. First is that infrastructure has long lifespans. This means that gender inequalities can be locked into infrastructure for like 50 years and longer. Infrastructure choices we make now can either help or hinder our efforts on gender equality in coming decades. And I'm sure we agree that we don't want to impose gender inequality to our children and grandchildren. On the positive side, gender-responsive infrastructure can provide women with long-lasting positive impacts. Many success cases on the ground show that well-designed gender-responsive infrastructure can be an accelerator for transformative change in many aspects and beyond generations. Second point is that importance of understanding the root causes of gender-blind infrastructures in order to come up with effective policy options. We need to pay attention to the discriminatory laws, social norms, and practices in the site, since they serve as the root causes of infrastructure gender challenges there. For example, we all know that infrastructure gaps such as water, electricity, and internet access affects women more negatively than men. And we know that female engineers and designers are underrepresented in infrastructure development. These are related to discriminatory social norms such as unbalanced burden of domestic chores like fetching water and firewood, and underrepresentation of women in the field of STEM. My Center's Social Institutions and Gender Index, SIGI, can provide unique insights on those root causes, since SIGI assesses discrimination in 180 countries and serves as one of the official data sources for monitoring SDG 511. The third and last point is urgency. The pandemic has highlighted the importance to addressing gender gap in infrastructure, in particular in the context of recovery and building resilience. Now, as African continent free trade area accelerates infrastructure development in the continent, it is critical for policymakers and stakeholders to work now on ensuring existing and future infrastructures to be gender responsible to boost women's well-being, capacity, and empowerment. I stop here and look forward to the discussion.
Ayuma, thank you for those thoughts. And without revealing your age, I must tell you, I went through your short bio, and what I saw was a woman who has worked with women's issues for almost all your working life. So we thank your presence here today. Let's move on and talk to Wanda about your thoughts. Dare I say, welcome home, Wanda. Really, it's the same question that I'm putting to you that I put to Ayuma. Your opening thoughts in respect to the role of infrastructure in advancing our economies and how we make women a central and equal partner.
Okay, thank you very much, and thanks for the opportunity to address women and other people, other stakeholders on this very important topic. I think for me, the important thing probably is to separate infrastructure past from the probability of infrastructure future, to separate what we know of as traditional infrastructure, which might have been power stations and pipelines, from the infrastructure where women should be able to play going into the future in connectivity, in the zero carbon economies, into going into fields that their parents or great-grandparents never even considered. And to me, our keynote speaker addressed the glass half full opportunity. And to me, that really is something that I'd really like to explore and understand, where women can, in a way, carve a new path rather than correct a path of history and inequality that they've had up to date. I think the idea of exclusion starts at the cradle, as was noted. It can be cultural, it can be educational, and all of those are things that can be addressed and should be addressed. I think by taking a Pan-African view rather than a country-specific view, we can probably leverage the strengths that people have, the ability to work together, to collaborate, to actually come out with a stronger African women force than had previously. The other key thing for me, people speak about the hard skills that people need to develop infrastructure. One of the key skills that people also need is business skills. So while we need engineers and we need hard technical subjects to be taught in our schools and universities to our girls. What our girls also and our young women also need is to understand how to operate as an entrepreneur in a developing country, because that is key. And I have seen so many strong women fail, so many technically competent strong women fail because of business skills and lack of acumen in that sphere, not through lack of trying, not through lack of effort. And I think there's nothing more heartbreaking than having a woman who's put her heart and soul into something and is falling at cash flow. So for me, there's a multitude of different topics that I'd like to think of, as I say, ranging from cultural norms to education, but also to focus on where infrastructure can be going into connectivity, going into carbon reduction, and those kind of things that I'd like to address during the conversation today. Thank you very much.
I like all the things you have said, but I like one in particular where you're putting the emphasis on defining what we are talking about when we say we're talking about infrastructure and women and infrastructure that will help to advance the role of women in our society. Let's get to Christelle. Christelle, welcome. You will notice that I put to you last because you're a young woman. You need to listen, but the amazing thing is when I read your story is that you have actually been doing a lot of talking and practical work on the ground. Let's get the opening thoughts before we talk about the difference that you are making in your community.
Yes, thank you so much for including me in this discussion. I think the past 2 years I've been concentrating on reducing unpaid, the time that women spend on unpaid domestic work, in particular, the time they spend fetching water. When we started working in the water sector, what I felt was very absent from the conversation, which I'm really hoping we can dive into today, is the cost of women's time. How do we value or take into account the infrastructure we create and the burden it puts on women to use that infrastructure or to access basic needs that such infrastructure is supposed to help them with. In the case of water, this looks like millions of hours that women are using on a daily basis working for water. Yet when you see the way water infrastructure is still being created in rural areas, it's more creation of public points than providing piped water right into homes, which we have the technology and the ability to be able to do. But public points are seen in ways as cheaper points because we're not factoring in the cost of keeping women working for that water. Another thing is, through my own personal experience, I've experienced the power of having free time on your hands. As a young child, I was not, after a certain point, I was not under the burden of doing so many domestic chores or having to do so much before I concentrated on being a kid and having fun and learning and reading books and exploring the depth of my imagination. So often, all of the burden that infrastructure or lack of adequate infrastructure, especially the infrastructure that helps us get basic needs such as water, electricity, food, all kinds of basic needs, we often fail to factor in the missed opportunities that lack of access to those infrastructure in a convenient way may create on the future of African kids, in particular, women and young girls who are going to grow up having a burden of, spending time doing house chores in ways that they shouldn't really. So I'm really excited for this conversation. And my opening thought is just that if we have the technology too, we should get the financing to make sure that we're not just creating any infrastructure, but infrastructure that allows women to access basic needs through convenient ways. So not just access, but convenient access.
Yeah. So I've moderated a few debates around the African continent, and one question that keeps popping up is, does Africa have the money for infrastructure development? The figures are staggering. We're talking about $100 billion. This is annual spending that's required. This money is not available. But often when you put up that question, you get the answer, no. The money is there. Remember the foreign exchange reserves that we have sitting in New York, in Frankfurt, in London, etc. This is our money that should be developing our infrastructure. So We'll park that one aside, but we'll come and talk about it. But in the meantime, I will say the money is there. We will find it, and we need to get it into the right projects. Ayumi, let me come to you. What we are talking about is not new. This work has been done over the years. Let's get the work that you as OECD have done on the ground to date.
Yes, thank you very much. Let me quickly introduce our works on today's topic, what OECD does. OECD recognizes that inclusive and accessible infrastructure is critical for sustainable development and the global recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. And we provide recommendations, policy notes, toolkits, indicators, and guidelines. OECD also seeks to leverage internationally agreed tools like G20 principles on quality infrastructure investment, which include accessibility and inclusiveness aspects, ensuring women's empowerment. My center, OECD Development Center, specializes in development and provides peer learning platform and policy dialogue platform, leveraging its unique membership. Among 55 member countries, half are developed countries and another half are developing economies, including 11 from Africa, including South Africa. We also engage regional and international actors. On infrastructure, for example, we work closely with African Union Development Agency, UNDP, and African Center for Economic Transformation, ACET, and we published a joint report last year to accelerate and scale up quality infrastructure development in Africa. The OECD also ensures that development cooperation project and finance to be gender responsive by OECD recommendations on gender equality. Yes, these are the summary.
Yeah, so you're active in 11 African countries, and I think if I remember correctly from my reading, I think you're active in Rwanda as well. I wanted to know, in respect to the work that you have done, what's the difference that you have made in the communities where you have operated?
Sorry, can you, maybe I couldn't get that.
Sure. I just wanted to know the difference that the work that the OECD has done on the African continent has made on the African continent.
Yes, we have been working closely with African-led initiatives, like African project in infrastructure development in African continent. And we work closely with African Union's initiatives. And our center is have a role to disseminate these African-led efforts to other part of the world.
Right. So you have brought lessons that you have seen in other parts of the world onto the African continent and haven't come to impose. You have worked on the ideas that have been generated on the African continent. Wanda, let me come to you. You, as I said, spoke about the need to define the kind of infrastructure that we are talking about, because infrastructure in terms of definition has certainly changed. I'm reminded of what we often talk about here on CNBC Africa, stock markets. I remember when I started more than 30 years ago, the biggest companies on the stock exchanges were mining companies. Today, the biggest companies are companies with no real visible assets as you and I know them. So when you talk about change infrastructure definition, very important. Give me your definitions and where you see this future infrastructure that we require.
And I think you make the valid point. I think infrastructure has become something that enables economic growth, but not necessarily in the hard kind of terms that we might have been used to it. Infrastructure, and in many cases, African infrastructure projects, traditionally, many of them were politically motivated. Sometimes people couldn't actually understand the sense of a lot of the infrastructure that was being put in, whether there were enough people to benefit from it, whether a new international airport really served a region. So now we are looking at connectivity in terms of IT we're looking in terms of broadband, we're looking in terms of people being able to network with each other, in terms of young people being able to get jobs in countries that they may not physically be able to go and live in. And I think that's becoming an important breakthrough in places like developing countries and developing continents like Africa and Asia, where people can now understand that I don't have to physically be in a building, in a city, that I, in a developing country that I perhaps cannot afford or am not able to migrate to. Because I have the infrastructure available here, I can still be employed where I am, I can develop skills. And similarly, skills can be brought to a village, no matter how remote. We don't have to build another school, which would have been our option probably 20 or 30 years ago. We can provide children with an education without a hard, a building shell, which takes up a lot of our capital, plus requires the skills of a teacher who may not want to go and sit in a remote area to be able to deliver quality service. So for me, those are the transitions that infrastructure is making. Even when it comes to logistics, how people are handling ports, that ports should be working on a regional rather than a standalone basis. Does it make very much sense to have 5 or 6 ports handling exactly the same things all the way down the East African coast? Similarly, along the West African. Many of these are politically motivated rather than economically motivated infrastructure.
Yeah. So to connect it to our discussion today, I wanted to know if there are ways in which we can ensure that women are equal users of the infrastructure that we are talking about, and who needs to do it and who needs to do what. I'm still with you, Wanda.
For me, the key enabler for women to become part of that is to radically rethink education right from the earliest stages of women. Now, that goes together with a social requirement to want to give education to women, which is still a cultural imperative. The kind of subjects people are exposed to, the kind of things that they are, kind of possibilities that are open to women from the very earliest opportunities. I think that to me is really where it starts. Entrepreneurs, we will always have entrepreneurs with us, but we do need to give that enabling environment for people to understand what is possible, first of all. I think many of us going out of school don't actually know what we could be doing. And there's not enough exposure of particularly women to roles that are probably unheard of and would actually tax the imagination of the people that are providing that guidance. So it comes down right from the top as to actually exposing people to what we could be doing and the art of the possible.
I'm going to come back and ask all of you how we ensure that the infrastructure that is being developed is one that women feel they are equal owners in terms of creation and also in terms of the uses that infrastructure is being brought on for. Christelle, I want to come to you. So Wanda touched something that I am very reluctant to discuss. And that's not because I don't think it's important. It is important, but I feel ill-equipped because I am outnumbered here, as you can clearly see. This is the issue of culture. And we know that the structures of our societies have been male-dominated. And we know that the developers of the infrastructure that we are talking about today, whose deficiencies we are talking about, has been developed by men. So I wanted to attack it slightly differently and ask for your views in terms of how we change culture from a woman's perspective to make it possible for women to be able to access the infrastructure that we are building and address one of the issues that you raised, cost.
Yeah, that's a big question. I think for me, it comes down to equality and equality now. As a young woman, this means so much to me. I don't have time to wait for the culture to kind of shift, or because then we can even get into debate of like, what is our culture? Because especially in the African context, our culture has evolved so much in the last 200, 300 years that it's hard to really pinpoint to what is culture. But I think within what women want and the increased participation of women in the economy and in the workforce, in politics and everywhere, you just can't continue ignoring women. And there is something that's very, I would say, almost systematic in how women are kept out of the decision making rooms or tables. And here, as a woman who tends to find myself in meetings or at different government initiatives or business sector initiatives, I almost always find myself alone or with another woman in a room with more than 10 or 20 men. And this is an experience that has been with me since I was in college and then as a young business owner and so on. So we do need to stop. We need to create more spots for women, and this starts with accountability. We need to look at all our data and look at it from a disaggregated point of view. If we say these many young people have been empowered to do a certain thing, how many of them were women? How many of them were men? When we look at data of, for example, the accessibility of an infrastructure, are we then adopting a gender lens and looking, were women more likely to respond a certain way than men who were questioned in the interview? But for me, another part that's very critical in my work within this whole conversation is really making sure women are given the space and the seat at the decision-making table. And it's not something that will naturally happen. As I like to say, whenever we work, especially in rural areas, you find that, for example, cooking is a woman's job until you give it a title and it's a chef, and then you find all the restaurant chefs are men. So this suddenly a woman's job becomes a man's job just because it's being compensated and so on. So these are the biases within our society that we need to question, because at the end of the day, they do achieve one thing, and it's to keep resources out of the hands of women. And this is seen, for example, in the supply chain of big companies and big organizations where, yes, they're investing in women from a programmatic point of view, but all of their supply chain, almost 100%, is coming from men-owned companies. So there is kind of an urgent need to bring a more focused view where we see data and look at it with the gender perspective, because we are coming from a world where women have been disenfranchised, kept out of the decision-making table, and been kept out of having access to resources.
Yeah, we are going to take questions a little later, so I encourage those of you who are listening to this to send in your questions, and we'll certainly put those questions to our panelists. Christelle, I want to stay with you. I want to ask you a difficult question. You're a young woman, you're 25, you were born post the genocide, so you grew up in a completely different environment. Culture is going to take time to change, but are you in that place where you feel that when you speak, when you express yourself, when you ask for things, do you get listened to the extent that you are able to fully develop your own ability to make a difference in your community?
Yes, absolutely. I'm one of the privileged people who happens to be in the best country to be a woman, Rwanda. So I can speak for everyone's experience. Right here, I'm very much comfortable in the power I'm given as a young woman in Rwanda. But at the same time, whenever we talk about women and the power we're given and so on, we have to remember that throughout history, women have always been able to step up. The conversation now is more, how do we allow all women, not just the few special women, to gain that seat and speak and be heard, but all women to be heard and to be part of the decisions that matter to them.
Wanda, how do we create little Rwandas across the whole of Africa, i.e. that society where we're able to allow our daughters to be able to be full participants and to help create the infrastructure that we require? I'm asking this question in the shadow of what is happening in Afghanistan. We all have seen the scenes of people trying to get onto these planes to get away. And the story is one that we are all familiar with. The strict rules around women in Afghanistan when it was ruled by the Taliban. How do we come back here and say we don't want to see what is happening in Afghanistan? What we want to see, as I said, more Rwandas that create the young women that we are seeing, such as Christelle.
Yeah, I think you touch on it in that you can do so much with policy. And I think across Africa, we actually in many countries have very good policy, which in theory empowers women, and there's good representation of women in many government institutions. within across Africa. I think what it has to do, and Christelle alluded to it, it has to become a success as a person, not necessarily as a woman, that you have got the platform, that you are normalizing female success. And I think the more we keep, and we do it for the best reasons in the world, we highlight this is a successful woman. It should not just be she's a success and she's a woman, or because it's quite remarkable because she's a woman. It's just she's a success and she happens to be 50% of the population group, which is female. So to me, the quickest way to actually normalize it is to turn it into something that is accepted as not being something extraordinary. Somebody has made this success despite being female and despite coming from a background. People overcome many disabilities and people overcome many challenges, economic challenges. Women do have gender and they do have other issues that they need to overcome. But to me, the only way we'll ever get to many Rwandas is when you can walk into a room and not be an exception in that room, as Christelle has alluded to. That you have to be able to walk into that room and say, well, I've got as much right to be in this room as anybody else. I'm not here because I'm special or because I am female. I think probably one of the mistakes that has happened is where people have tried to create special categories for just women or for just empowering. And they've actually found that there's a lot of backlash, in fact, from males and females, because then the credibility of worthy successes also gets called into question.
Yeah, very profound words you are using there, and I'm catching how many of them? 1, 2, 3. Normalizing women's success. I'm glad I'm talking next to Zinati here, who we have certainly mentored and tried to help to grow as part of our own development program here at CNBC Africa. Ayuma, let me come to you, and I come to you. Let me preface my comments to you a little bit differently. So, when we started a program for the month of August of honoring women here on CNBC Africa, the ladies that I work with said, Godfrey, we don't want to bring these ladies and say to them, show us how powerful you are. Talk to us about the success that you have had as a way of demonstrating that you are making a difference in your community. Rather, can we talk about the issues that you deal with on a daily basis, either as a CEO or an executive director or an engineer such as Christelle? And I thought that was very powerful indeed. And I hear you when you are talking about normalizing women's success. Let's go to Ayumi. So Ayumi, I want you to draw from your experiences in the work that you do helping other communities in different parts of the world. And I want you to talk a little bit about the difference that infrastructure that is positively geared towards women makes a difference, i.e., what is the cost of not helping women achieve their full potential?
Yes, thank you. We hear a lot about cost of gender inequality, including huge loss to the global economy. Gender-blind infrastructures increase these costs for sure. But the biggest cost or negative impact is that we impose gender inequality that is locked into gender-blind infrastructures to next generations. And here, I'd like to turn to positive side of infrastructure, some success cases, to have better image on what gender-responsive infrastructures can bring to the society. Let me share some examples I was involved on the ground. Many studies, I'm start from many studies in developing countries show that gender-responsive infrastructure can generate positive labor market impacts on women. The research in Pakistan shows that more women apply for jobs in the areas where women exclusive cards are provided compared to other areas. So this is a good example of infrastructure well adapting to the gender social norms practiced in the site, the root causes of the gap or challenges. Another example is India's Delhi Metro, one of the largest mass transit systems in the world. Japan has supported its development since 1990s, incorporating the gender perspective from early stage. According to the beneficiary survey, users' voices show that Delhi Metro improved public security and enabled women to go out, women, including young women, to go out frequently alone throughout the day, even after dark. And parents now allow daughters to get better job and higher education, even far from home, because parents now understand that their daughters have access to safe means of transportation. This has increased women's opportunities with long-lasting positive impact. One last example, Delhi Metro also actively involves women in its operation, and now there are many female conductors. This added an important role model for younger generation in a society where female conductors had been rare due to social norms and gender stereotypes. I recall my colleague had a conversation between mother and daughter at the metro platform. Says, look at the female conductor. You can become conductor in the future if you wish. I love this conversation because this illustrates that gender responsive infrastructure can change social norms and gender stereotypes, and it becomes an accelerator for transformative change in many aspects and beyond generations. Learning from these success cases across geographical regions, from Asia to Africa, Latin America, Africa, this could be instrumental. And I believe multilateral organizations like my center can play a role in providing a peer learning platform for that purpose.
100%, 100%. Ayumi, thank you for those thoughts and that intervention. If you're joining us now, we are talking about the challenges of accessibility in infrastructure, and we are talking about ways in which we can ensure that women become equal participants. As I said, we are taking in questions as well from you, so do send them in. We have one here. This is Princess Lorna, daughter of His Majesty King Bungane III. Here's the question. I feel honored to be here. How do we assist women in the traditional leadership as they are clueless on what women can do out there? If we can assist especially women in the rural areas. So this is an important one, because while we may be sitting here in our air-conditioned offices, the vast majority of women, of course, are sitting in the rural areas. How do we make sure that the inclusivity that we're talking about for women in general, it also applies to women in the rural areas? Can I ask for one of you ladies to take that one up? I think Christelle should be able to answer that. Wanda should be able to answer that too.
Yeah, let me go ahead. We work a lot in rural areas, and as I kind of began saying, we really need to look at the data and make sure we're not excluding women, but including women. For us, one of the key ways we're involved, most of my team is women. When you go out there repairing broken pipes, installing new water points, communities for the first time may be seeing the first woman technician they've ever seen. So me creating a company that works in rural areas and opening up positions for women technicians and inspiring more women to become technicians and engineers is really creating a ripple effect in how young women we're finding in the rural areas see possibilities in their future careers. The next way we're involved is in creating committees that manage water points and deal with us and other water stakeholders. So often when we go in a new community to create a new water point, we do assist them and train them into creating their own committee. And one of the things we started doing is making sure that they are women elected to be part of that committee. So I think it was something like when we started, no woman was ever elected president of the committee, but they will be given a role, usually treasurer or a different role. And rather than see this as a negative, it was an opportunity for communities to see women in the leading point and get comfortable slowly with that. Because again, we're working against a norm where women were not given this piece of power within the communities. But what we noticed as well was when we were working in a community that's led by a woman, whether the village head or by the cell head, they were more likely to elect women to be part of those committees. So over time, you're seeing women now being elected and chosen by their fellow members to head those committees and so on. So it's a matter of creating role models and driving the conversation when we get the chance, even in those rural areas.
Yeah, and it wasn't because of the way they look. I make that comment because I'm sure you'd have had to deal with the stereotypes. How did you deal with men who would come and say, this is not the role of a woman? Because I know, definitely having grown up in the rural areas myself, that would be a comment that you would get from, perhaps I was going to say one drunk, but it might not be drunks that make those comments. Men generally would make such comments because that's the way we've been brought up.
Absolutely. I think over time you learn to just hear and ignore such things. I think the funniest for me is always when they realize I'm actually good at what I do, or the women are good at what they do, then they are saying things like you never get married, or the fact that we're so good technically will forbid us from building happy marriages.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, I've seen this detract many women from choosing STEM fields. And hopefully through role models, again, women doing this and being successful both in their careers and in building families and being good members of their societies, we're going to dispel these myths, because they are myths, they're not true.
Absolutely. Thanks very much for those comments. Wanda, you want to add?
Yeah, building on what Christelle was saying, we found what worked very well in rural areas was to take success stories that we had within, for instance, our organization, young graduates, and we sponsored awareness days at schools, at high schools. So in other words, for your grade 11s and 12s. And it would come under a very social gaze, and we would bring in coordinators from a whole lot of universities and technical institutions to actually create far more awareness for people for what they could be doing and what they might have been exposed to in the first place. But the most powerful thing was those young graduate women going back into the deep rural areas where they had come from, where in many cases they were the first graduate coming out of that family. They had gone into a technical discipline, and their parents might not even have understood what a quantity surveyor or a project manager ever did. You know, This was something that they might not even know. But going back and explaining to 15, 16, 17-year-olds what the possibility was, and that there was a world out there with universities and technical institutions, and even not a technical institution, post your matric, that would actually give you these opportunities and create these platforms. And I think that's a very important message to take across into a rural area, particularly a deeply rural area, where there's often a very hopeless narrative that comes out of life after school, or very limited vision of what comes out as life after school.
Yeah. And to your point earlier, it's normalizing these things and making sure that they become everyday. Let's take in some more questions. We've got one here from Vivek Mittal. What should business leaders do to promote diversity and gender equality? Are current funding and policy initiatives enough? Who wants to take that one?
I'm happy to address that one.
Please do.
It's something we've wrestled with across the world. Okay, we're a global business. And while it might be an issue in developing countries, it's an issue in every country. And I think the first thing is to recognize diversity. While women are part of a diverse, diversity has to embrace all sorts of diversity, whether it's physical diversity, whether it's preferences, whether it is gender, whether it is race or nation. So there is a requirement for a policy. It has to be extremely inclusive, not exclusive. And you have to walk the talk. You have to continuously have awareness programs for people. It's not something that gets done as a once-off, nice-to-have gesture. It's something that you have to live as a culture. You have to keep enforcing with people. You have to keep emphasizing. It's the only way it becomes a norm.
Yeah, the culture part is the hardest part. I've been taking notes, and I'll tell you what I'm going to take away from all of this. But we have to tackle it, and we have to begin to make it normal. I'm taking in more questions. This one comes from Marcel Abrams. I've always been impressed with Rwanda, mandating that women are included in their policy deliberations and ensuring, I think, that tailed off a little bit. Maybe she wanted to add another thought there. But the last point is that she says, thank you and well done. Christelle, you need to respond to that one. I've always been impressed as well because, of course, Rwanda is the only African country which has a majority women members of parliament, right?
Yes. The thing is, the quotas work. I think one of the reservations I've heard about quotas is you can put undeserving people in seats that maybe they don't deserve. But I want people to think that, to remember that we are facing a problem of exclusion. So it's not that they are not capable women out there, but that they are excluded from roles as a baseline. As a baseline, women are excluded. So to fix that, you need to include them, and policy helps a lot. So I remember first when the quota was set for parliament, it was almost like women were being encouraged, pushed, run for parliament. But now we could see when elections happen, women are really competing and trying to get themselves elected, and require that first push. So rather than making a chicken and egg situation, what policy can do is say, we're going to include women, and we're not going to wait for women to fight for their seat. We're not just going to remove the barriers. We're actually going to push for these results to happen. And that's where policy really shines, and quotas work. Whether it's quotas that include women or young people, if you leave it to nature, just remove barriers, it's not going to work, because there is more bias that has developed within the culture, within people, over the time that women and young people were being excluded. So it takes more work to go over that culture. So creating role models sometimes feels like a forced action. To get the first women parliamentarians, to get the first women to do this, get them as a mass movement, it feels like a first action, but that's where policy can really help achieve results, not just in removing barriers, but in making good outcomes happen.
Yeah, I'm taking that point that you're making quotas work. I'm going to try and see if we can get more comments from our panelists as well. Ayumi, I wanted to know if this is something that you've encountered in the work that you have been doing as part of your OECD work, or perhaps in your previous work in Japan.
Yes, I've experienced in some cases that quotas for women works very well in some cultural in a cultural context where the social norms and social norms are so adverse to women. Sometimes we need to take such actions as affirmative action for women, and including quota for women. Even in some technical cooperation projects in the village where the gender norms are so strict. So we need to make it compulsory to include female participants 50% into the project we provide in that area. So without these quotas for women, sometimes we cannot reach out to the women, which we would like to support.
Yeah,
so
Wanda,
some countries it is.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
Wanda, would you agree with that?
I think it's extremely important. I also like what they're saying about it not being a specific cultural issue. In fact, to me, what women should be doing is looking to other countries, looking what is possible and what has been done. I think it's often very easy to get blinded by what is happening in your own environment right around you. But by taking the lessons that other women in Africa or other developing countries or across the world are doing, and where they are leading, I think can be very inspirational and can actually keep people going through really tough times.
It goes actually to the last question I wanted to put to you, all of you as our panel today, as to how we make sure that women become the agents of change. And I think this is an issue that Ayumi addressed at the beginning, agency. How do we give them the practical tools that enable them to be participants? And we've touched on some of them here. We're talking about changing policy. We're talking about education. We're talking about tackling culture. But in the here and now, how do we begin to give girls who are coming up practical tools in a society that they are already part of, ways in which that they are the change agents themselves? I'm going to begin with you, Christelle, because you have practical work on the ground, and then we move through to the other panelists.
Yes. Sorry, I might have missed some of the intro, but some of your questions. But I think in order to empower women, really, it works from removing barriers, giving them the role models, and making sure that we're creating access for women to be in the. Sorry.
I'm agreeing with you. I'm getting the point. Role models. I'm taking notes. Remember, I'm learning. I'm a father.
All right. So role models, access, and definitely get more resources through our hands. Include us in your supply chain, include us in your roles, in your jobs, everywhere that decisions are made, everywhere manufacturers, women should be there. And I think for me, that's how I would really summarize it. But in removing barriers, because this is an issue very close to my heart, is to create the infrastructure that creates convenience. Because when there is no convenience, it's the women who carry the burden.
Yeah.
It's the women who fetch the water when they have to work for it. It's the women who have to miss school when the schools don't have toilets. So create convenience with the infrastructure.
Absolutely. Wanda?
Yeah, going on with convenience is safety. We need to create a safe environment for our women, because if women cannot get to an educational facility, they cannot get to work, they cannot get home in the evenings, it severely limits what they're ever going to achieve.
Yeah.
I think another important thing is for women to support women and use all the tools that are availability, the social media, the platforms, to actually celebrate what women are doing and to create the kind of networks that people need to support themselves to go through it, and not look at borders, not look at what discipline you're in, but actually go across all of those things and build support structures that can help and empower people. Those are quick things that can be done for me.
Yeah. Ayumi, your turn, and you can also wrap your thoughts on our discussion today.
Yes, thank you. Yes, indeed, there are great role models and efforts by women in Africa. For example, African Union has a commissioner on infrastructure and energy who is a woman, and championing to ensure women's voices are incorporated across infrastructure value chains, including the PIDA program of infrastructure development in Africa. And important change agents of women like African Network for Women in Infrastructure, ANWIN, developed gender-responsive infrastructure development guidelines, GRID, to be used across the continent. And international and multilateral organizations like us can work with and support these efforts, including through innovative finances and through like multilateral efforts like my centers, disseminating these African role model activities by providing peer learning and policy dialogue platforms on an equal footing. Yes.
Ayumi, thank you so much. Ayumi, thank you. Wanda, thank you. Christelle, thank you for joining and educating an old guy who's got daughters, who is trying to support, but certainly giving him practical examples of ways in which he can help them be empowered immediately. And I dare say there are millions more men like myself who will also benefit from this education. Thank you very much for participating in our discussion today. Zinati, I don't know what you took. I took copious notes, and I wanted to tell you what I took. Okay. So I wanted to say to you, I took policy action is one key ingredient where we can make a difference. Education, yes, long term, but certainly we can never be late in terms of starting.
Indeed.
Culture, challenge me as you do every day, and eventually my thinking will change. But the practical wins today, really easy ones. Role models, preferential treatment, safety. So women must support women. Yeah. PhD, we don't want that one.
And I think you're actually the perfect person to take this panel, because I mean, we do need to change cultural norms. And I even like the fact that they said we need to normalize the success of women. And I'm glad that you are here as well, because I think in the station we do know that you are the kind of editor-in-chief that has normalized the success of women. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, thank you very very much, Godfrey, for leading that discussion on the challenges of accessibility in the industry. Also, one key thing that I took out is that we do need to change the definition of infrastructure, where it's not like back in the days where it was just power stations, but we do have infrastructure soft infrastructure that contributes to the economic growth. But next up, we have a one-on-one interview with a young woman who joins me from Nigeria. She is the founder of a company that specializes in technology-enabled healthcare focused on public-private partnerships in Africa.
Dr. Ola Brown, the founder of Flying Doctors Healthcare Investment Company.
All right, thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Ola Brown. Now, I just want to start off with the challenges that Nigeria faces in terms of the healthcare sector. The country has the biggest GDP on the continent, but yet so little goes into healthcare expenditure. Why has Nigeria's healthcare sector been so poor, and what challenges do we need to sort out in order to turn that around?
Okay, first to give you some context, I'm a medical physician, I'm also an economist, and I specialize in infrastructure finance. So my first degree was in medicine and my second degree in finance and economics. So I will be moving in and out and weaving in and out between sort of three disciplines as I sort of go forward with this interview. So in terms of healthcare infrastructure, I don't think it's just a Nigerian problem. I actually think it's an African problem. Africa has overwhelmingly the worst healthcare outcomes in the world. So in terms of like the number of children that die in a year, or the proportion of children that die in a year, in terms of the HIV/AIDS burden, in terms of the number of mothers that die in the process of pregnancy and childbirth, across Africa, we have the worst outcomes. So I'm talking about worse than Iraq, worse than Syria, worse than Afghanistan, in many places in Africa. And that's all due, these millions of people that die, preventable deaths every year, is all due to underinvestment in healthcare infrastructure. And I think it was possible to ignore the importance of investing in healthcare infrastructure prior to the COVID-19 epidemic, or pandemic now. But I think that the pandemic, one thing that the pandemic has done for African leaders is bring healthcare into sharp focus, especially in the lockdowns, where a lot of sorts of politicians that perhaps would normally get their healthcare in Europe or America or Asia couldn't fly out. And we saw instances of politicians across Africa saying, you know, I didn't know that the hospitals were this bad, you know, and we desperately need to do something about it. So I think that, you know, the COVID-19 pandemic has really brought this issue of Africa having the worst healthcare in the world, of any continent in the world, into sharp focus, and has highlighted the $66 billion gap in healthcare infrastructure on the continent.
So would you say that because of the problems that COVID-19 has accelerated, I mean, you talk about politicians now having nowhere to go for their healthcare needs, but in Africa. So are you saying that the political will now has been accelerated because of those challenges that the wealthy and the affluent have been exposed to?
Absolutely. I think that, you know, sometimes, and this goes for not just politicians, but any people, if a problem doesn't directly affect you, it might be difficult to think about it in a completely objective way. But I am now seeing increased political will across the continent, and we invest across the continent in healthcare infrastructure. So we're seeing it from west to east to Central Africa, a lot more focus on how to improve healthcare infrastructure. And not just infrastructure in hospitals, because when we speak about healthcare infrastructure, most people think it's just hospitals, but it's actually hospitals, it's primary healthcare centers, it's diagnostic centers, it's water and sanitation projects, because let's not forget that the top killer of children under the age of 5 years old in Africa or one of the top killers isn't something that needs to be treated in the hospital. It's actually basic diarrhea due to lack of access to water. So all of these projects now, I am definitely seeing, and we are definitely seeing in our firm, sort of an increased amount of political will due to the pandemic and the complexities with regard to mobility, with regard to logistics, and with regard to severe illness that the pandemic presented.
And I'm even hoping that even us as citizens in Africa will also bring into the fore the healthcare agenda when we are electing our presidents and our leaders, because often really the healthcare agenda is overlooked when we do vote for our leaders. So I just want to go into then the investment, boosting investment in the infrastructure, healthcare infrastructure space. What kind of tools do we need to use to boost investment in that space?
So there's two sides, and I'll speak about it in sort of what we need to boost investment in healthcare. I'll speak about it from the side of governments and public sector, and I'll also speak about it from the side of the private sector and what the private sector need to do. But before I go into that, I'd just like to pick up on your earlier point about the political space and the role of citizens. Where there is good healthcare, you see that healthcare is normally high on the agenda for citizens as well. So in America, one of the top 2 issues that Americans vote on is healthcare. And you can see that American citizens get very, very it really sort of is a divisive political issue. And we probably know more as Africans about Obamacare and Trump care and Medicare and Medicaid than we even know about our own healthcare systems, because Americans are very, very vocal about healthcare. And in the UK as well, the NHS is sort of an untouchable political force. I mean, it's part of, I grew up in Britain, and part of being British is, you know, loving the NHS and supporting the NHS. And it is a big sort of political, it would be impossible probably for a politician in Britain to survive if they made cuts to the NHS or introduced policies that reduced NHS access. So now what can we do in Africa to increase the amount of investment in healthcare? So from the private sector side, which is where I play, running a healthcare investment firm that offers growth capital for private sector firms, as well as infrastructure finance. I think that from the growth capital perspective, I think one of the major factors that sort of affects private investment in healthcare, that's sort of venture capital and private equity type investments, is around access to capital. So around people being able to fundraise for their institutional funding, I mean, for relatively new asset classes like PE and VC in Africa. But on the infrastructure side, I think that one of the biggest barriers for private sector sort of players in the infrastructure space is actually skills and know-how. I think that corporate finance is very or relatively well known on the continent. So people do a lot of corporate finance type deal structures. Project finance, however, is a lot more complex. Project finance it also involves complex contracts. It involves a lot of specialist knowledge. And I think that, you know, there is a skills gap in Africa in terms of the skills needed to put together PPPs and project finance structures. There's also the issue of access to capital. These tend to be big deals. And in terms of the sponsors or the type of sponsors that institutional investors want to see at the head of these deals, sometimes that's lacking as well. But on the public sector side, I think that, you know, people always talk about bankable projects. And to make healthcare bankable in Africa, where most people can't pay, the government needs to be involved. And I think the government needs to make it a policy objective to support healthcare projects by offering the right kind of contracts, the right kind of assurances, the right kind of guarantees to make these projects bankable. And we've not, prior to COVID-19 at least, we didn't see that kind of intentionality from many African governments for a whole host of reasons, including the fact that a lot of them didn't know that healthcare was this bad. Healthcare infrastructure was as poor as it is until they actually were in a position or in positions where they had to use the hospitals themselves or use the healthcare facilities themselves, and then sort of got that consciousness that this is an area that needs huge improvement. Like I said, it's a $66 billion gap. And then also, I think the politicians were more focused on hard infrastructure. So the typical African politician, I don't know how it is in South Africa, but definitely in Nigeria, from a public sector perspective, they want to show things that they've done that look solid: airports, roads, bridges, and healthcare, power stations, right? And healthcare infrastructure was kind of neglected in favor of things that they thought could bring about economic growth, like airports. The link between building a new airport and bringing economic growth is very clear. It's very well researched that if you improve road infrastructure, then it enhances trade, and that brings about economic growth. However, I think that we neglected to sort of, and maybe this is the fault of the medical community, maybe this is the fault of infrastructure, investment professionals that focus on healthcare like myself, but we haven't really advocated and communicated the link between healthcare and economic growth. There's actually data that shows that investment in healthcare and wellness on the continent can create 16 million jobs. Wow. And a recent paper from the IMF shows how investments in healthcare and sanitation in emerging and poorer countries actually have a huge jobs multiplier and a huge effect on the economy. And perhaps we had not communicated that. And also in the public sector didn't have that depth of understanding to see the link between investment in healthcare and jobs and growth. Particularly in South Africa and in Nigeria, I know we have this in common: high rates of unemployment, a lot of young people that are unemployed or underemployed. And investments in healthcare aren't only great for health, but they're also great for jobs and great for the economy. And I think that that's something that we have just begun to come to sort of the realization of, whereas before our infrastructure efforts concentrated on roads, bridges, and power stations.
Yeah, and I'm just interested actually in the success factors that we do need to build a fruitful and bankable projects in healthcare infrastructure.
Absolutely. So healthcare isn't free. Somebody has to pay for it. And usually citizens can't afford to pay for it. So I'll give you an example of the UK NHS, because that's a system I'm familiar in and I've worked in. The UK NHS system costs the British government about $200 billion. Sure. $200 billion would pay Nigeria's federal only healthcare budget for 200 years. So not only is it sort of something that citizens usually can't pay for, but it is a big expense. And you see developed countries spending between 7 to even up to 15% of GDP on healthcare. So unless governments are making it a priority and are providing the structures in terms of sort of guarantees and contracts and reassurances to make sure that investors can get their money back, there will continue to be underinvestment in healthcare. And the NHS in the UK, Turkey, for instance, has had a very, very successful project, public-private partnership structures, which we can just copy. Honestly, the PFI system of bringing investment into healthcare in the UK was extremely successful and brought huge amounts of public sector finance into healthcare infrastructure. And these are, case studies that aren't hiding. They're things and programs that African policymakers can copy and learn from and adapt to our environment to bring in that much needed private sector capital into healthcare. We know that fiscally, our governments are squeezed. Again, I don't know the figures for South Africa, but definitely in Nigeria right now, we're spending almost 70% of our budget on debt servicing. Our debt to revenue ratios, or our debt servicing to revenue ratios are some of the worst in the world. So we know that our governments don't have the fiscal space to make all the investments that they need to make in healthcare, in education, in defense, in aviation infrastructure, in road infrastructure. I mean, it's too much for governments that already, have little fiscal space to do all of these projects. So the need for private financing, the need for institutional private financing is greater than ever before, because we know that our governments can't do it all by themselves. And that's why putting in place these sorts of guarantees, these kind of working with the governments to put in place structures that allow for certain levels of income for the private sector to be assured, bearing in mind that citizens can't pay for this service, it is really, really important for making these projects bankable. Of course, there are private sector revenues that can come into healthcare in all sorts of different ways. And insurance schemes that can be put in place, government-backed insurance schemes that can be put in place, specific taxes that can be put in place for revenue assurance. But these structures really need to be built in collaboration with the public sector.
Indeed, collaboration, and that is exactly what we need for the success of the healthcare infrastructure space in Africa. Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Ola Brown, the founder of the Flying Doctors Healthcare Investment Company. Let me welcome my colleague and fellow CNBC Africa anchor, Esther Awoniyi, who will lead our final panel discussion on the role of women in infrastructure. We have had a really insightful day, Esther, where we started off with gender mainstreaming, basically having a conversation about how women need to be involved in every process of infrastructure development. And then we had a discussion on addressing the challenges of accessibility in the infrastructure industry for women, and a very important topic that you are tackling today. Great to have you with us.
Thank you so much, Zinathan. It's a pleasure to join you from Lagos for this important discussion. But before I welcome my guests, let's have a look at this background package on the role of women in infrastructure.
Sustainable infrastructure refers to the development of roads, buildings, technology, energy, water, public transport, efficient buildings, and other infrastructure in a manner which ensures a long-lasting impact. It facilitates economic, environmental, and social benefits for our communities and improves the environment as well as the distribution of funds. Sustainable infrastructure plays a key role in economic development, encourages job creation, and opens up access to goods and services, as well as other necessary resources. Women have historically been left out of traditional infrastructure fields. They hold only 17.5% of jobs in the EU's transport sector and represent only 20 to 25% of the workforce in the energy sector. Women's underrepresentation in these fields doesn't just hurt them, it hurts everyone. Ensuring that women have access to opportunities in sustainable infrastructure projects can spur economic growth, improve environmental outcomes, and generate social benefits.
And now, let's meet the panel.
Anik Muhama, Director General for Energy at the Ministry of Infrastructure in Rwanda. Zinat Gore, Director of Aspire Consulting Engineers. Ramaya Dorasamy, Co-founder and MD at Meadows Energy.
It's a pleasure to have you all with us today. Thank you so much to my panelists for making time out to be with us today. Today, we're making the case for women's participation in infrastructure development and, of course, also infrastructure careers, infrastructure sector careers. So my first question to you is, I know that you've probably been listening to my colleagues talking about gender mainstreaming and the importance of women's participation in infrastructure, but I'd like my first question to you to be, why does gender matter? How are the outcomes different when women participate in infrastructure? And do the downsides of an exclusion in women in infrastructure affect just women or everyone else? I'd like to start with Musa. Musa, I'd like you to just share your perspective. We're looking at the importance and the significance of women participating in infrastructure development. Okay, while we wait for Musa to join us, perhaps Zinat, you could kick things off for us.
Hi, and thank you for having me, and it's wonderful to be here. I think your question is very pertinent when it comes to women in infrastructure and why is it important. And I think the important element is, what do women bring to the industry? I am a civil engineer by profession, like you mentioned earlier, and our focus is really on buildings and bridges and design elements associated with service delivery. And I think the element that women bring to the business in our space is really about the care and the attention to detail, and ultimately the emotional attachment and the emotional outcome of the work that we do. So I think we're less focused, and maybe it's a bit of a generalization, but I think that from a, we're very focused on caring and caregivers, and we're very emotional in our outlook in life. So I think when we bring those elements to service delivery and service provision, it becomes a benefit to the people that we're doing the work for, as well as the end users.
Romaya, let's hear your perspective on why gender matters in the first place in infrastructure, sustainable infrastructure development.
Thanks, Esther. I think being specifically in the energy space and more on the cleaner energy side, I think I concur with Zinat. I think as women, we bring a lot of emotional but care aspect to infrastructure itself. But I mean, from an energy perspective, I look at it from a safety perspective, because as women, we need to get to and from our homes to a workplace, and street lighting, etc., and how we get that energy to, call it, public spaces and private spaces is important for women. So I think there's a twofold of safety, the emotion that you bring to it, as well as the professional aspect of it, and empowering women to be more in, call it, the industry where it's very male dominated.
Anik, let's hear your perspective.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak at this very important conference. I'll share my insights and share also the Rwandan perspective. So to respond to your question on the significance of women participation in building sustainable infrastructure, we all know very well that gender equality is a key element for ensuring inclusive and sustainable development and progress in any society. So for our case in Rwanda, we do recognize the important role that women and men play in the process of national development, and the country has made commendable progress in terms of mainstreaming gender in its policies and programs. And this has been generally well demonstrated in our country's Vision 2050, the National Strategy for Transformation, and the revised national gender policies. So we also do understand the importance of infrastructure, not only for sustainable development, but also for the development of a competitive private sector, which is considered as a pushing factor to invest in infrastructure projects. So therefore, from my perspective, building sustainable infrastructure is essential to foster equal opportunities by ensuring women participation in infrastructure projects and services for citizens. And this is very critical to foster socioeconomic development of the nation. But still, as the previous speakers mentioned, due to cultural and societal barriers, women participation in infrastructure development projects and other sectors of the economy has been limited for quite some time. But however, if I can share more insights, research from the New Climate Economy has shown that women equal participation in the economy in general can have a considerable positive impact on the global GDP. Therefore, women participation in the labor force can advance sustainable development by implementing infrastructure projects. And in addition to socioeconomic benefits, women's participation in infrastructure project development brings social changes that advance women's status in their communities. Thank you, moderator, for this opportunity.
Thank you, Anik. Zinat, let me come to you. Now, we often hear that opportunities are missed when infrastructure isn't built with the needs of women in mind. We hear terms like infrastructure blind, or looking at infrastructure through gender lens. Could you just talk to us what that means to you, or perhaps one or two examples that you can point to in terms of those kind of opportunities that women miss out on when infrastructure around them isn't built with their needs in mind?
So, sure, I'll talk about it very much from the purposes of where I operate, which is, like I mentioned, the built environment space, particularly focusing on infrastructure and development and services. Women, especially in South Africa, there's been a big push for inclusivity, and we often have a lot of challenges, especially during COVID. It was highlighted where gender-based violence instances were very much on the uprising because of everybody being at home during the lockdown and that sort of thing. What you realize and what you learn from there is that gender-based violence is something that needs to be carefully considered in the way that we plan our routes, in the way that we plan transportation routes, in the way that we plan our public facilities. A few examples, we recently went on a discussion in terms of how do you design spaces in public transport facilities and nodes that take into account a woman's needs. So there's simple things that get overlooked. For example, a public toilet. We looked at how a public toilet is used for men and how a public toilet is used for women. What are women's needs? We need more space. We need facilities for childcare, changing of diapers. We need facilities for prams, for just a bit more room to move so that we can actually make sure that we have space for our children, because typically when a woman goes to work, they're taking their child with them to drop them at daycare. And it's about how do you integrate that. When you look at transportation routes, when women are going home from work, if they leave work at a certain time that's later due to like sunset and it becomes more dangerous for women, so how do you create safe public transportation services for women when they are traveling from their place of work to their place of home, whether it's safe nodes along the transport routes, whether it's a buddy that joins them with it. Recently, I heard about an app that's been created where a woman leaves work and they're on a platform, which is an app created by a woman, specifically targeting women not being alone. So what happens is a woman can actually ping on the app and they can say, okay, this is their route, and then they can be followed home. So those sorts of things within the transportation system is quite important. Also with regards to workspaces, there's been a big push now because people and women are coming to work. Sometimes they're still nursing. There's ability for a woman to have access to a nursing facility where they can either express breast milk for their children or they can have childcare. It's just about gender inclusivity. It doesn't mean that you do inclusivity only with regards to work opportunities. It's also how do you make the space comfortable for a woman that has children, that's a specific age, that has specific needs, to be incorporated into a society and a culture that promotes growth and promotes the child and the mother and all of the needs with regards to women to be accommodated.
Zinat, you made some very interesting points there. We'll come back at some point to expand on those points. Rumaya, let me come to you. And as Managing Director of an energy firm, you're also navigating what is perhaps also a male-dominated industry. From your experience, what would you say are some of the most common barriers preventing women from meaningfully participating in the infrastructure sector, particularly at decision-making levels? Now, experts tell us that these barriers exist on both the demand and the supply side.
I think, being an engineer as well, you grow up in a sector where you are the minority. So I think it probably goes back to when I started out my career. But in essence, in the energy space, and I think something that we could actually be very proud of what our government is doing right now in the renewable energy sector, where the inclusivity of women ownership as well as women participation in our renewable energy program, which we just had recently. We're seeing these barriers, or call it inclusivity, happening at those levels, where from a management control, from the perspective of owning shareholding in projects, so energy projects specifically, as well as being part of the procurement cycle. So there's a real call of thresholds where women participation has to happen, otherwise you're disqualified from these programs, which is great to see. I think this is going to start spurring on more inclusivity and more sort of entities being formed where women own these entities. But I think it starts even further from there, Esther. You need to start, motivating girls in schools to see that the opportunities in the energy sector, for example, these are the opportunities they can get involved in electrical engineering, industrial engineering, even civil engineering. I think there's lots of opportunities that, young girls need to be educated about and see that these are opportunities for everyone. And I think it also not just it's the women's part, it's also men, and men need to empower women as well as women empowering women. So I think it's a joint, call it, effort from both men and women to empower younger girls to see that the opportunities can come to them if they work hard, and these opportunities which government is also portraying, by women inclusivity and programs.
Romaya, I'd like to stay with you. Now, it's been said, and I'm happy you mentioned the education side of things. It's been said that many job opportunities that will be generated through the low-carbon transition will require sound technical skills. Now, we know that the disparity between men and women in the STEM field, looking at the numbers, are not very encouraging. Where do we need to start to ensure that women are equipped with the right skills needed for those jobs?
As you just mentioned, Esther, it starts at school, right? We need to encourage girls about sciences and getting more involved in that. I mean, even when I was in school, doing physics, etc., wasn't something that was pushed in an all-girls school, and I think it needs to really start at the basic levels of, motivating or driving this agenda at school levels. Because I think if you go to an all-boys schools, physics and biology is kind of the top levels, as well as mathematics. And I think we need to start pushing those agendas at the school levels so that girls can get those skill sets at that young age, and then see role models, I guess, who are older and have made it in the industry in different sectors, amongst all of the, call it, male-dominated sectors of engineering. But I think when you're seeing it in the STEM areas, I think there's so many different levels. I mean, you've got your project financing, you've got the technical side of it, you've got the legal side of it, and the whole permitting aspect, which is the environmental side, which you could get involved in. So there's multiple layers of where women can get involved in, as well as procurement and construction and operations of these power plants across the life of them.
Oh, fantastic. Now, I think at this point we can all agree, and there's also data to show that when governments embark on gender-responsive infrastructure, the outcomes are different, not just and of course involving women in the entire life cycle of infrastructure development project also has positive outcomes, particularly for women. Now, Anik, at this point, how do we generate commitment and action from governmental institutions and the private sector that have an interest in gender-responsive infrastructure development? And also, I'd like you to share examples from Rwanda. Are there any examples you can point to in terms of what Rwanda is doing in terms of involving more women in infrastructure development, and also your ministry, if there's any if gender is taken into consideration when you launch projects?
Yes, thank you very much. In order to ensure that governments, policymakers, and development partners commit to having more women in the infrastructure sector, an emphasis on systematic advocacy for the removal of restrictive practices from gaining gainful employment in the infrastructure project, because some of these restrictive practices are still being observed across the supply chain of the infrastructure industry. So therefore, advocacy is very key in this area, and specific guidelines can also be put in place to address the concern and to monitor the implementation of gender mainstreaming strategies in terms of monitoring baseline data against targeted results or indicators. We also do implement the use of quotas, which is very important, which is a very important tool to increase and monitor women's employment ratio in infrastructure projects and other sectors. As regards to the Rwandan perspective on gender responsive infrastructure, it's indeed very well known that the infrastructure sector plays a key role as a driving force behind the national and socio-economic development, and the sector has made commendable progress in mainstreaming gender in all the subsector policies as aligned to the revised national gender policy. And we have taken a step higher to develop an infrastructure gender mainstreaming strategy following the recommendation by the Ministry of Gender and Family Promotion. So there are national policies and guidelines that all public institutions should develop their own gender strategies to put into action national and international commitments such as the Sustainable Development Goals. The same call for ensuring that gender is mainstreamed in all sector plans and actions is highlighted in the Rwanda's National Strategy for Transformation. Therefore, the infrastructure gender mainstreaming strategy outlines how the sector should mainstream gender in its policies, plans, processes, projects, and programs. Some key strategic objectives that I can share here is that we put emphasis to improving institutional and human resource capacity for gender equality promotion in the infrastructure sector. The strategy also focuses on enhancing gender responsiveness in the delivery of infrastructure projects and services. This is actually done to improve access to sustainable and inclusive job opportunities in different infrastructure projects and investments and services, thereby providing equal opportunities to both men and women in all the infrastructure projects across the supply chain. Thank you.
Zinat, I'd like you to also weigh in on this, how we can get particularly governments to come in or come up with an integrated policy approach to sustainable development for women. We've talked about how the private sector, the role of the private sector also. But talk to us how this is playing out, if you see this playing out in South Africa and the impact on the ground, if any.
Thanks. You know, I think it's amazing that we can sit here and have a platform discussion about how we create inclusivity for women within the sector. I remember when I started studying engineering in 2001, my dad told me, he said, engineering, like, who does that? You know, like, that's a man's world. Are you going to climb scaffolding? And are you going to go to site? And what are you actually going to do? Because women don't become engineers. And it's 12 years later, and we're sitting around and having a discussion about how to create inclusivity. And, you know, often people talk about everything the government does wrong, where it's creating inclusivity for women is where something where the government is doing right. And whether that remains to be implemented remains to be seen. But there's been a big move in public sector tenders in South Africa. The Johannesburg Development Agency about a month ago released a tender for a woman-only panel to design and build and implement a project for the Johannesburg Development Agency. I was amazed at the leaps and bounds that we're taking, and I thought that, you know, it's August, it's Women's Month, and it's amazing that they put together this panel. So the architects are women, the engineers are women, the contractors are women, and I think it's amazing. I think within, obviously the JDA is a government-based organization. Within private sector, there's been quite a push in terms of how you have a woman on projects and whether it's women on site that are doing cleaning or housekeeping on site or whether they're doing bricklaying. there's a big push to transfer skills to women within the private sector as well. And on the financial side as well, for funding of projects, when you have a Black woman-owned business, you get preferential scoring in terms of your funding as well, which obviously leads to you getting a project that's sustainable. I think it starts from the top down and it starts from the bottom up, where you say, what are women passionate about and what are they interested in doing? And not having people being in boxes where they say that this is a woman's job and that's a man's job. And I think the narrative is changing. It's taken us quite a long time, but I think that every change that needs to be sustainable does take a long time, so it is inspiring. I think that if you look at projects that we're busy with and how there is a shift, it's organizations like this and discussions like this that create awareness about women being in the industry and being in the field and taking on STEM careers. Earlier, there was a discussion about going to, the Mesa was saying about doing at the grassroots level, teaching children and women and females about science and physics and that sort of thing. I think it's just about creating the expectation to say that there aren't limitations on you. You don't have to be a man to be an engineer. You don't have to be a man to be in STEM. And it's about changing the dynamic with regards to that. And I think there's been buy-in from private sector as well as government sector. And that's why we have the ability to be able to have discussions like this. Because if there wasn't any buy-in from all of the key participants and all the stakeholders, there wouldn't necessarily be all of these confidences and all of the discussions and all of about how to change the narrative. So I think the part that we see, the stories that we hear, the leaders that we embrace, the leaders that we see are showing us that there is definitely change that's been happening and the stakeholders are committed to change, which means that they give us the platforms and the opportunities. And there's change in the philosophies, there's change in work on site, there's change in the people around the boardroom. So you can see that the change is real. So it's exciting to be a part of the change.
You're absolutely right, Zina. It is also important for us to also highlight the progress that's been made so far. I know that the African Union does have a project, a program where it's beginning to integrate gender equality into its infrastructure project. So that's definitely encouraging to see. Now, I'd like everyone to weigh in on my next question, and that's how we can, specifically now, with perhaps specific examples to how we can level the playing field for gender equality in the infrastructure sector. Now, what are the tools that can be deployed? Let's start with Rumaya.
Good question, Esther. I think it's always, we have great intentions, and it's always about making it practical and going to work with it. So I think it starts at the basic, and I think I'll go always back to it. It's the education part of it, right? And it stems from there. And if everyone gets the same, call it education benefits and opportunities of, being involved in all sorts of subjects and not saying these subjects are for boys and these subjects are for girls. And I think it starts from that level. So I think those are the, call it bare minimum tools of encouraging girls to get involved in more, call it maths and sciences, to start leveling the field in the infrastructure space.
Anik, would like to hear your perspective, and perhaps if you could also point to how this could play out, or if it's already playing out in Rwanda.
Thank you so much, Esther. So as the previous speaker mentioned, resistance resulting from cultural norms, misunderstanding of gender principles and dimensions due to inadequate gender-related education, as well as the lack of adequate mechanisms have contributed to low participation of women in infrastructure projects, straight from the design stage and down to the last stage of the infrastructure project cycle. And yet we all know that diversity contributes to innovation, and therefore women perspectives in the design and management of infrastructure will both enhance service delivery today and contribute to innovation in the future. So we therefore need more women in infrastructure, in design firms, in construction companies and utilities. Initiatives such as the Women in Power Sector Network in South Asia and other parts of the world should be replicated in our African context to enhance women's participation and influence in the infrastructure sector. These types of networks actually aim to enable more women to join government, utilities, and the private sector bodies so that they can make a stronger contribution to promoting an inclusive infrastructure that works for both men and women. Therefore, infrastructure that works equally well for everyone needs to be transformational for women, for economies, and for the society as a whole. Other key strategies that are being implemented on the national level is enhancement of participation of women in infrastructure projects by setting targets for women and men participation at the decision-making level, and by ensuring that project committees, implementing organs, and management, as well as monitoring arrangements, are gender responsive, and that gender balance is addressed in their own structures, decision-making processes, as well as selection processes. Thanks.
Now, I think before I move on to Zinat, I know that Rwanda is a country, at least at the governmental level, where we're seeing more women taking up positions, leadership positions there, and even young women. Talk to us about, are there any targets that the government has, or that on one hand, and on the other hand, is there a broad recognition on the part of the private sector to make it a priority to recruit more women who have the right skills now at decision-making levels?
Yes, thank you. The Constitution of Rwanda guarantees that at least 30% of decision-making positions should be occupied by women. So this constitutional guarantee has therefore enabled high representation of women in decision-making and government processes, where in most cases this quota is considered as the minimum ceiling for gender parity in various institutions and sectors of the economy. For our case, this is based on the Gender Monitoring Office data that was published in 2018. Women were represented in various public sector entities by 61% as members of parliament, whereas 53% were women members of cabinet, and 41% as permanent secretaries, and 49% in the judiciary. This is important to note that these are 2018 data that might have been slightly increased. In regards to your questions, in women representation in the private sector, still based on the 2018 data, we have in place what we call a gender accountability program, or it's also known as Gender Equality Seal, which was initiated by the Private Sector Federation, the Gender Monitoring Office, and the UNDP. And this program is striving to promote gender accountability in the private sector. Women are represented in the private sector at the decision-making levels, but still in limited numbers. In accordance to the 2018 data that I had earlier mentioned, women represent 30% at the decision-making level and at the PSF. So more efforts are still needed to bring more women on board, especially in strategic positions in the private sector. Additionally, women's representation in the labor force is still low compared to men, especially in male-dominated activities, and this also needs to be addressed by the Gender Accountability Program. Thank you.
All right, now Zina, when you think about the as we're moving to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, now for SDG 5 specifically, gender equality and empowerment of women and girls, how do you think of it in the context of overall infrastructure? Because when we talk about infrastructure, as we all know, it's not just hard infrastructure, but there's also soft infrastructure, and infrastructure is so integral to the achievement of the entire SDGs as they are. Talk to us about how much more progress perhaps we can make if taking women more seriously in the infrastructure sector is made a priority. Do you think that we can achieve more progress in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals?
Yes, definitely. because building sustainable infrastructure is very essential to foster equal opportunities by ensuring that women participation in infrastructure projects and services for citizens as a critical component to foster socio-economic development of the nation. But still, as I mentioned previously, we still observe some cultural and societal barriers whereby women participation in infrastructure development is still limited. But I do.
All right, Anik, I actually wanted Zinat to answer that question. Thank you, Anik. Zinat, if you can hear me.
I can hear you. I can hear you. Thanks for that. Look, I think that it's. Can you hear me? Thanks for that.
Yes, go ahead, please.
I think that we have leaps and bounds to go still in terms of getting to a point of sustainability and having sustainable development where we integrate women. I think that everything is a journey and we need to set ourselves realistic and achievable targets. I love that in Rwanda, there's obviously such a big push to have women and they seem to have gotten such leaps and bounds ahead in that. I think in South Africa, you are seeing a lot more of that, but it does take a long time. In terms of the infrastructure, the long-term impact, I think for us, what it's about is creating a sustainable plan in terms of sustainable infrastructure. There's a move at the moment in terms of government to create entities that can provide energy. There's a move to create infrastructure and create labor-intensive programs where people can come on board and construction programs can be labor-intensive. And within that labor-intensive job creation, there's a component of that does create a specific requirement for a certain component of women to be empowered on those programs and on those projects. I think that with the right skills and the right training and the right leadership, there can be more of a push on gender equality and there can be more of a push for getting more women involved. In terms of your earlier discussion about leveling the playing field, I just wanted to comment a little bit about that. I had a colleague that went to his normal doctor, and when he got to the doctor, there was a female locum that was actually substituting because he was on leave. And he came back, we were in a board meeting on one of our projects, and he said, it was amazing the attention to detail that the woman actually paid in terms of how she did the checkups, where she did checks on, how long the appointment itself lasted, and how thorough she was with the investigation. And we had a discussion relating that to engineering. And I think that within, because women have typically been thought of as inferior and that they're not able to do designs as well, or they're not as strong as their male counterparts, we've often had to counteract that by being, by trying a bit harder and putting a lot more effort in. And I thought about your comment with regards to leveling the playing field. When we start leveling the playing field, does it mean that we'll get to a point where women won't try as hard as they did previously? So I thought that was just an interesting take on it. And I think that as far as possible, we should always push for inclusivity. And while we talk about gender equality, I think that we also need to understand our limitations. And maybe it's a bit controversial to say this, but you can be anything that you want to be. But women are also created physically different from men. And it's important to leverage that and use each person with their skill sets to leverage the best of their ability.
Fantastic. Rumaya, I'd like you also to weigh in and share your perspective on this, how we're, as an African continent, how we are thinking about our journey to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And since we know that at the heart of it all is infrastructure, and now that we do recognize and there's data and statistics to prove that the outcomes are different when women are involved the entire life cycle of infrastructure projects, just how much more of a buy-in do we still need at this point? I mentioned earlier that the African Union does recognize and has taken some concrete steps to involve more women, women with the skills to also, and also at the community level, women with maybe not the right skills, but also women at the community level who can also have some input into some community-based infrastructure projects that are having very positive outcomes, especially for women. So just to weigh in, to hear your perspective, how much more of a buy-in do we still need? We see the AU putting its money where its mouth is, but in terms of overall what we still need going down the road, what is your perspective?
Thanks, Esther, for that. And I think, South Africa is possibly, I sometimes feel, leading the pack on that, because being part of the renewable energy program for a number of years that I've been part of it, having communities involved, having women involved has been, one of the, call it, key things that I've seen in the outcome of this renewable energy program. And we've seen it now in the latest round where, call for actual women participation is a key factor into the structuring of deals, which is either at ownership levels of the project SPVs, as well as the engineering or construction companies and operation companies, which is something new. So we're seeing the changes, which is always positive. And I think I'm hoping that this transpires throughout the continent as well. And communities are so key to any of our infrastructure projects, and I can speak specifically for energy, is because a lot of our projects are in very remote areas where, it's affecting communities. And I think as my own personal goal, as well as Meadows Energy goal, is how do we impact these communities positively by, having these projects in their areas, as well as, uplifting those communities in some, whether small or big way, is something very dear to my heart. So I think it's always about equal participation. How do we change the lives of those people in those communities, Esther? And I think we're seeing from those, you're going to see female leaders being born, where they can see, change is possible. And it's up to, I guess, all of us sitting here around the table to impact every single girl that we meet. And spreading the voice of, that they can be anything. And as Zinat says, we all can be anything, but we must do it within our limits. But it's every person's duty to uplift women and bring equality to all of us.
Absolutely. Now, Anik, what advice do you have for young professional women who are looking to make an impact in key infrastructure sectors, especially at the leadership level? When we have conversations like this on talking about inclusivity, inclusion, gender inclusion at the workplace, we talk about, of course, having the right skills. We talk about mentorship. We talk about allyship, etc. But what advice would you have for young professional women who are looking to make an impact, or just looking for a pathway into infrastructure sectors? Annie, can you hear me?
Sorry, I was on mute, sorry. My piece of advice is that for young professionals, especially women, emphasis should be put on the need to enhance the understanding of gender equality concepts and effective gender mainstreaming and accountability across all sectors of the economy to improve gender responsive planning and implementation of programs. This can also be part of sector policies and associated strategic plans up to the district level. This inclusiveness of the role of men and women is very key to foster the participation of women and young engineers in the infrastructure industry. Thank you.
Zinat, we know that South Africa's construction industry is a rather difficult one for a woman to enter and succeed, but you have been able to do that as an entrepreneur in the sector. What is that advice that you also have for women coming behind you? Any tips, or one or two? I think we have about 4 minutes left. What is that one advice from you?
The one advice is to be bold in the face of adversity. I think you need to realize that if you're going to jump into the punching ring or, the boxing ring, be prepared to put your hands up and, hit some punches, and not physically punches because you'll get kicked off site, but anticipate that there will be adversity and be bold in the face of it, and surround yourself with like-minded people that are in the sector, because we definitely rise by lifting others up.
Okay, with about 3 minutes left now or less, so let's just take some closing thoughts. Romaya, we've talked a lot and highlighted the importance of women's role in infrastructure. There's, like I said, there's the data, statistics to prove that outcomes are different. So I'd like you to just highlight your hopes, to talk about your hopes for the future, the types of milestones that you'd like us to achieve in terms of how we make our infrastructure on the African continent more gender responsive.
I think the big dream, of course, would be one day that we don't have to have gender equality or equity discussions, right? And that we're all on the level playing field. So that's the big dream. But I think it's for everyone to feel when you at work that you don't have to constantly prove yourself because you're a woman and because you've always been seen inferior. So that for me is when you sit at the table, you feel like you belong. And I don't think a man would ever understand that as women. When we sit at the table, there's always these thoughts that they call inferior thoughts, that you don't really believe that you're supposed to be there because of, I guess, prehistoric conditions. But I think one day the hope is that we're sitting at the table and we believe and know that we belong there. Thank you, Esther.
Okay, Anik, what are your final thoughts, your hopes for the future?
Thank you so much. Just a second.
Thoughts, please. We've talked about, we're just wrapping up the conversation. We've highlighted a number of factors, the importance, looking at the importance of the role of women in infrastructure and how the outcomes are different when women are involved in sustainable infrastructure. So just your closing thoughts, what you're hoping to see as major milestones on the African continent going forward.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Annie, could you unmute your mic, please?
Yes, it's unmuted. I was saying that my hopes is to see a totally gender-responsive infrastructure sector to ensure and to continue ensuring that opportunities are equally shared among men and women alike in order to deliver sustainable and inclusive services with a gender and social inclusion lens, which in return would present greater and socio-economic benefits. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Thank you so much. And a very big thank you to all my panelists today. We really do appreciate your time. I've been speaking to Zinat Goel, Director of Aspire Consulting Engineers, Romaya Dorasami, Co-founder and Managing Director, Meadows Energy, and Anik Muhammad, Director General for Energy Ministry of Infrastructure, Rwanda. Zinathi, it's back to you now.
Thank you so much, Esther, for that insightful conversation. I was thinking during the conversation that imagine the impact on economies and communities if we make women essential and key participants in infrastructure development. And then I thought, well, I don't have to imagine, because all our panelists have really laid out a path, especially with DFIs like the DBSA, really ready to finance initiatives and projects, infrastructure projects that are led by women and that are gender sensitive. Thank you for that. It is time to bring today's proceedings to a close with closing remarks from our sponsor, the Development Bank of Southern Africa.
Bathobile Sowazi, Company Secretary at the Development Bank of Southern Africa.
Thank you, Program Director, Ms. Zinati Kuma. ABN, Group Managing Director, academic scholars, CNBC moderators, esteemed panelists, viewers and patrons throughout the African continent. Ladies and gentlemen, today's occasion marks another key milestone in our long-standing partnership with ABN Group and CNBC Africa. Through this partnership, the DBSA, ABN, and CNBC Africa have come together to host the Women in Infrastructure Conference under the theme, Creating an Inclusive Infrastructure Industry. The Women in Infrastructure Conference assembled infrastructure scholars and thought leaders to explore ways of creating more inclusive structures, networks, and systems to aid in the reduction of perennial inequality, to drive productivity, increase land values, and boost economic growth that have been challenging governments for centuries. In our robust engagements and deliberations, we acknowledge the mammoth task to address the glaring and significant challenges that have prevailed since time immemorial. The speakers and contributors have spoken in one voice that gender mainstreaming is a key consideration in infrastructure financing decisions. The future success of any organization in the financing landscape lies in how it transcends and shapes the new normal for diversity and inclusion. So the debate has shifted from the number of women involved in boards, parliaments, leadership roles, supply chains, and related statistics to the actual value addition that gender brings to infrastructure financing. The diversity and inclusion agenda dictates that organizational leadership consciously embraces the past realities about the outcomes of its policy frameworks, the systems, practices, and how these have impacted the diverse cohorts of employees, covering Black, white, female, male, living with disabilities, the young and the old. As a development finance institution, the DBSA has adopted a more gender-aware financing lens by deliberately calling for programs and deals that address inequality at all levels. Albeit that we are at the infancy stage in our journey, but we have made it a deliberate, strategic stance in an endeavor to shift the needle and ensure that women get equal opportunities in driving infrastructure development in South Africa and in the continent. In our pursuit to bend the arc of history, we have taken a bold stance to incorporate gender mainstreaming in our operational practices and deal-making activities. This is because we recognize that gender equality will not be achieved without a systematic and consistent approach to gender mainstreaming. Our gender mainstreaming standpoint is not just a goal to empower women. It is rather an ongoing process where we assess the implications of any of the bank's planned program of action, policy development, strategic intent, and business procedures on all genders, be it women, men, and the LGBTQI community at all levels of employment. So in the spirit of inclusion and diversity, through our gender mainstreaming strategy, our purpose is to make every effort to hear all voices of DBSA stakeholders. It is a framework for making all genders' experiences, interests, and concerns central to policy design, program implementation, and business monitoring and evaluation to realize equality of opportunities. As a business imperative, we envision gender lens financing and investment being incorporated in all our business endeavors, such as infrastructure planning, investment and delivery, given that women and men need equal access to socioeconomic opportunities linked to inclusive growth. The prevailing infrastructure blocks and backlogs on the continent demand a concerted effort to take full advantage of opportunities to realize infrastructure development and solicit sufficient financing sources. The exclusion of women as beneficiaries, financiers, and users of infrastructure means that a huge part of the social problem is not addressed, leading to lost financial and financing opportunities. The 2011 McKinsey Global Institute report states that $12 trillion could be added to global GDP by including women's contributions to economic growth. The Deloitte report, also of the same year, refers to the gender dividend and women as the next emerging market. We have thus committed to supporting the SDGs, including Goal 5, gender equality, where investing and financing women-owned or focused deals will result in growth in the economy and the social infrastructure sector. In conclusion, I would like to thank you all, including our viewers, for being here today for this important discussion, for continuing to demonstrate your commitment to this issue of women in infrastructure. It has been clearly set out that creating more inclusive structures, systems, and networks helps not only to reduce inequality, but in the main, boosts economic activity. There have been significant movements in the right direction. However, we need to continue to do more in order to transform our communities, our country, and the continent. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Bathobile Sowazi, Company Secretary of the Development Bank of Southern Africa. Indeed, with the implementation of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area on the continent that has accelerated the need for infrastructure involvement, we do need to accelerate our effort to include women in that infrastructure development and also gender lens of financing and investment. A big thank you to all of our amazing speakers and panelists who joined us from as far afield as Houston, Texas, Paris, France, to right here in the continent of Africa. And thank you to all of you who joined us on the webinar and on CNBC Africa. I'd like to wish the women of South Africa a prosperous and promising last week of Women's Month, and to our wider African audience, strength as we all move together toward gender mainstreaming. And as Roberta Naika said in her opening address this afternoon, if women have to hold up the sky, as the Chinese proverb goes, they need to stand on a strong foundation, and concrete development cannot happen without engaging both halves of the population and leveling the playing field. From me, Zanati Kuma, and the rest of the team in front of and behind the camera, it's goodbye until next time.